The pitter-patter of rain can certainly be comforting on a dark night whilst trying to fall asleep. But it can also be used as a smokescreen for those out to get you. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Around the time I was a sophomore in college, my parents decided to tear down our house and rebuild, seeing as a lot of people in our neighborhood were doing the same for value purposes. I had made multiple jokes about how cool it would be to get a secret room that no one knew about, but didn't actually expect them to take adding it into consideration. Turns out, they worked with the contractor and ended up having an area set aside. Basically, if you're looking inside my closet and turned right, you could walk to the corner where there was a 1.5-foot bar to hang clothes. If you moved these clothes, there was a wall behind that you could push open, and bam, the hidden room, fully equipped with ceiling lights and electric plugs. Imagine how many games of hide and seek I won. No one ever found me. The room was my precious secret, and I wasn't going to share it with any person outside my family. Unfortunately, after a few months passed, I began to get tired of the room. First of all, trying to squeeze past all of the clothes proved to be a pain. Then I'd have to slide through the tiny space to get to the room, which wasn't all that big itself. The magic had worn off, so I stopped entertaining it. Fast forward a couple of months later, when things had begun to get weird. Our family had left for vacation 2 weeks earlier, so we had one of our neighbors take care of the house. We had been having a lot of crime in the area, so she occasionally stopped by to just check. When I had gotten home, I was exhausted and wanted nothing more than to crawl into bed. Opening the door to my room, which was dark, I noticed that something was off. I could see a faint glow coming from underneath my closet door. Okay, I thought to myself. My neighbor must have been going through my stuff. So I walk over to turn off the light, only to realize that the closet light switch was facing down. Confused, I opened the door, and to my horror, I notice in the corner, all of my clothes had been shoved aside, so the wall to my secret room had been pushed open, and that light was on. How was it possible? No one knew of that room other than my parents and the contractor. I stood there in utter disbelief for about a minute, until I realized that my neighbor must have really explored the place. I warily made my way to turn off the light, followed by putting the wall door back in its place and moving the clothes back to their normal formation. I'm going to try and explain what happened next as best I can. Still kind of freaked out, or at least confused, I start to exit my closet. I'm standing in its frame looking across my room into the corner, where I have an iron floor mirror. I'm looking at the reflection when I notice that the closet space behind me suddenly lights up, and I hear this scraping noise, or at least I think that's what it was. My heart had been pounding so hard that my ears could only hear the rush of blood with every beat. I remember jerking my head back inside my closet to find that all of my clothes were moved aside and the wall was pushed open, and, you guessed it, the light to the secret room was on. Once I was able to move from my petrified state, I convinced myself that I had been so confused when I had initially seen the secret room open that I had not closed it back at all, but I knew that I was lying to myself. Throughout the next few months, strange events kept happening. There weren't anything major, but still, weird to the point that I couldn't explain them. For example, I would walk into my bathroom only to find that my toilet seat was being left up. Every single time. I was assuming my dad was coming into my room to use it, but that would mean he had a serious case of an overactive bladder. When I approached him about it, he looked at me as though I were crazy and asked me why he would use my bathroom when we had one down the hall. I couldn't answer that question. There were other instances where I would wake up in the morning only to find that on multiple occasions my closet door was wide open. Before any of you say that it's not a big deal, let me clarify that I had been slightly terrified of my closet and made sure every night that the door was closed before I went to sleep. I would check to make sure I heard the click and pull back and forth a few times to prove it had been shut all the way. There was no reason it should be wide open, and there was also no way to explain why, occasionally, the light was turned on in the middle of the night. I know, malfunctioning lights and toilet seats don't come off as scary, but bear with me. I was freaked out to the point that I finally approached my mum about it when we were both working in our downstairs office one day. Here's a bit of background on her. She doesn't believe in ghosts whatsoever. In fact, she raised me and my older brother, who had been moved out since we lived in the new house, to think that any person who believed in ghosts was crazy. So when I tell her of my superstitions, I'm surprised when she sighs and says that she's noticed weird things have happened too. She continued to tell me how when we first moved into the house, the one that we tore down, she would always hear footsteps walking around in my brother's bedroom. This would confuse her, because he was at school every time this happened. But she could have sworn she heard him running around. One time, when she'd walked up, toys were sprawled across this carpet. This took her by surprise, because he had never left his room like this before heading out. She then went on to explain that the previous owners of the house had a young son that died in my brother's room, which is what led them to sell the house, which she never told me about before. I'm guessing she had thought I was old enough to know now, and not form any irrational stories about ghosts or our haunted house. If that had been her goal, I hate to inform her that it absolutely did not work. At this point, I was now positive that our house was haunted. She wrapped up her story and laughed it off though. It's silly to believe that there wasn't a logical explanation to weird things happening. The footsteps coming from the old house was because it was old. The lighting and the toilet issues was stemming from the fact that the house was brand new. Yeah, okay. At that point, we swiveled around in our office chairs and continued working on our computers. After a minute or so, I could hear this sound, almost white noise. I turned to my mum, thinking she was taking a break and watching some weird video, when I noticed she's looking at me with the same confused face. "It sounds like your shower's running," she said. My bedroom and bathroom were directly above our heads. Our dazed expression stemmed from the fact that my shower hadn't worked for a good month or so, as a new house comes with many problems. Right as she said that, the water had stopped running, and things went silent, right before we heard 5 loud footsteps. I remember seeing my mum turn white, and immediately bolt upstairs past my dad, who was sitting on the couch watching TV. I finally joined her, only to find that she was looking in my closet, under my bed, everywhere. She had tried to explain to my dad what she had heard, but he insisted it was some piping issue, and she eventually believed him. There was no way that was piping. I just kind of stayed upstairs, accepting the fact that something weird, but probably harmless, was occupying my room. Oh, and as I was thinking about everything that had happened, I realized that my current room is exactly where my brother's room used to be. I know that's not how hauntings work exactly, but it makes for a better explanation at least. I grew up in a haunted house, but I'm not sure if it was me or the house that was haunted. I've had spooky shit happen to me my whole life. This is one of interest. I'm not here to prove that the supernatural exists. If you don't believe it, that's fine by me. But I know what I experienced. When I was a young child, I had an imaginary friend called Sally. She wore a white dress, black shoes, and a red bow in her hair. She was white and had blonde hair in a ponytail that went down to her waist. We would only play in my basement, never outside, in a park, or upstairs in my home. As I got older, I forgot about her, and I figured that she was just a fragment of childhood imagination, and didn't think about her until I was a teenager. My best friend and I were talking about our childhoods, and eventually spoke of imaginary friends. I brought up Sally, and to my surprise, my bestie described her to a T. I asked her how she knew, and she said, "Sally is in the corner. She's always in the same room as you. She doesn't like that I can see her, and is glaring at me." That gave me chills. Whenever my bestie was over from then on, I would ask her where Sally was. She would point to a corner, and I shit you not, I would see a white flash in the spot she had been pointing. My ex-boyfriend told me that he would see a split image of a little girl glaring at him from corners if he entered a dark room alone. I was talking to my current boyfriend a couple of months ago about Sally, because he believes in the paranormal. When I described what she looked like, he got pale and told me that he too had seen her. According to him, he saw her in a closet one day. He opened the closet, and right in front of his face was a pale blonde girl with a white dress and a red bow. Her eyes were pitch black pits, and her mouth was agape with pointed teeth. Ice went down my spine after he told me that. I told him that my favourite place to hide as a child was that closet. I played a lot of hide and seek in that house, and no one ever found me in that spot. My boyfriend's childhood home is also haunted. If you look in the kitchen window at night, you can sometimes see a face looking at you in the second-story window. His parents have both said they'd seen it. I've seen it too, and it scared the crap out of me. My boyfriend's house was haunted, like I said. Here's an incident that happened at the time. He and I are weirdos, and fairly quickly into our relationship, we started discussing the paranormal. He said that, as a child, he would see figures running in the patch of trees behind his house. He told me about the face in the window and phantom footsteps that would walk around his house when he was home alone. I didn't doubt a word. One night after work, he picked me up to spend the night at his house. I worked really late, so it was around 1 a.m.-ish, and we hung out in his garage so that we wouldn't wake his parents up. After we went to bed, I realized that I had left my purse in the garage and stepped out to get it. At this point, I had seen the face in the window, so I was wary of his house at night. His garage is detached from the house, so I had to go outside. I have to fully step inside the garage to reach the light switch, and to my dismay, the lights barely turned on and only gave off half a flickering glow, as they were old crappy tube lights. My heart was pounding, as I walked into the depths of the half-lit garage. As soon as I grabbed my bag, the lights turned off, and I heard the sounds of children laughter surrounding me. I booked it back inside and didn't even bother hitting the light switch. I told my boyfriend, and we both didn't get much sleep that night, and I have never been to that garage alone since. This other incident happened to me. When I was a kid, I had friends in the neighborhood that I hung out with all the time. There was an old lady down the street that we called Granny Shay, and I would go visit Shay to swing on her tire swing sometimes and play with her cats, crows, and kittens. She always fed the strays and birds, so they were friendly. Granny Shay loved me, but hated the other kids, as they were mean to her cats and ruined her garden. Granny Shay passed away when I was in high school, and her granddaughter rented a room in the house to one of my childhood friends. One of the boys that Shay had disliked so strongly. One night, the granddaughter was away, and my friend had a small party at Shay's house. We were sitting in his room when he told us that Shay had died on the very bed that we were sitting on. Being teens, some of the guests started yelling at Shay, demanding that the spirit show herself, taunting her, and saying she was dumb for dying, and stupid and stuff like that. I got uncomfortable, and stood up to leave. Before I got to the door, the lights in the room shut off, and I was next to the switch, and went to flip it, when I felt that it was already in the on position. I turned the switch down, and the lights came back on. They immediately turned off, and I turned them on again. Then the lights rapidly started switching on and off, even though at this point, I was no longer touching the switch. Some of the people in the room started yelling at me for messing with them, and the lights turned back on with a feeling of finality. On the wall above the bed was a black handprint that had not been there before. We yelled and ran out of that room, and I ran back home and never set foot in that house again. Looks like Shay had the last laugh after all. I'm a hotel employee, and I used to work overnight shifts for a few years. I have seen some shit. The hotel I worked at is a great place, well maintained, high occupancy, high rates until the weekend hits. Friday and Saturday nights are slower, so the rate drops brings in not so savory folks. I have two stories that are good. This hotel is 100% pet friendly. Mostly, we get dogs, cats, birds, and occasionally we get snakes, lizards, and a few pot-bellied pigs. Now, the shit show of a few weird nights working overnight. I came into work at 11 PM, and it was a quiet Saturday night. I ploughed through the paperwork, finished all of my duties for the night, and was kicking back watching movies on my laptop. All of a sudden, a guest comes to the desk, asking if we had a room with 2 beds available, the rate, and asks about our pet policy. I answer their questions and check them in. The guests leave and said they were going bowling and that they would be back. A few hours later, at around 2 AM, they call the front desk for an extra robe and remind me to deliver it, saying they would make me worth my while. I ask the bellman to go watch the desk and go deliver the robe. I get to their room and knock on the door, and the guests ask me to come back in a few minutes. I go smoke a cigarette and come back 10 minutes later. I knock again, and they ask me to go away and come back later. I oblige and as I'm walking away I hear a snorting sound. The sound was horrendous. It sounded like a pot-bellied pig. I am walking away thinking, what the hell is going on? My bellman calls me on my walkie-talkie and asks if I called the fire department and an ambulance. I let him know I did not, and I walk back to the room. I drop the robe at the door and knock to let them know I had an emergency to attend to. The guests fling the door open and frantically ask if I was the fire department. I look down the hall and see paramedics and firemen racing towards me. I look in the room and see a 250-pound woman in nothing but a robe and a red thong laying motionless on the floor. The woman is grey with foam coming out of her mouth. The pig noise was the woman fighting to breathe. I step inside the room and hold the door for the emergency personnel. They ask the couple what happened, and the couple responded that they happened to have met their friend in the bowling alley. They were all celebrating their birthday and had too much to drink. Their friend was too drunk to drive, so they came back to the hotel to let her sleep it off, and she just collapsed. They give the medics her name and as much information as they know about her. By this time, the sheriffs arrive to escort the medics to a hospital. The sheriff sees that this couple are bullshitting their story and asks the medics to empty the woman's purse. What falls out is a pharmacy of pills and powders, along with her ID, and pieced together the woman was a pill-popping prostitute. The couple fesses up that she was popping pills and drinking heavily all night. The medics cart the pale woman away, still in the robe and thong, to the hospital. The sheriffs give the guests and myself the information on this woman for my report. The guests then stay in the room, watch about $100 in adult movies, have a huge breakfast in the morning, and check out late. The second story is about an older gentleman that walks into the front desk at midnight asking for a room. I give him the details and check him in. He seemed normal and quite cordial. The gentleman goes into the room, and a few hours later comes down to the front desk and asks me if I know where to score some ecstasy. I tell him no, and he storms off out the hotel, mumbling to himself saying that he wants to kill me. Now I don't feel endangered by this guy, as I have a weight and height advantage on him. I know how to handle myself thanks to my training by an ex-Marine brother. He comes back to the hotel a few hours later in a much better mood. Me, on the other hand, am scared shitless. He comes strolling in, wearing a thick sheriff's officer jacket and a sheriff's hat. He asks me if I have a girlfriend, and I reply yes. He tells me to dump her because women are evil, and then he tells me his story of heartbreak and revelation. The guy went to prison for beating his ex-wife in a rage of finding out that she cheated on him. He had a revelation whilst in prison that the best experience was lovemaking to a man, and that women were the devil. The guy then warns me to dump women and consider men. I apologize to him about how I am straight and thank him nonetheless for the story. He then walks away, saying to reconsider and not to knock it until I've tried it. Once he left, I called 911 and asked if anyone is missing a jacket and a hat. They say they will check on the on-duty officers and will call back. They call back and ask me if the person was staying at the hotel. I confirm with them the details and the description. They inform me to keep away from him, that he took a brick to a window of a cruiser, as the officer was on his lunch break at a nearby diner and was just doing paperwork at a table, and stole a taser jacket, hat and club. A few minutes later, the hotel is surrounded. The officers ask for his room number and an override key. I provide them all the information, and the officers race to his room. They find him watching adult movies, sodomizing himself with the club. They come out with the guy cuffed. He yells to me on the way out to reconsider his beliefs of women. Surprisingly, his credit card went through for the charges. My wife and I bought a house last year, and it's been a bit odd, with some minute activity, strange sounds, whispers, etc. But my wife and I are like lightning rods for it. So whatever. What was especially odd is one of the houses we viewed when we were house hunting. It was a brick fortress, like house surrounded by a black wrought iron fence with a waist-height gate. Upon entering the house, it felt very, very uncomfortable, and the air was very dense. The first floor had a living room just inside the door which led to the kitchen. There were a few other rooms, but each room connected to the next, and were maze-like. The house was a Cape Cod, and the second floor was especially strange. The floor had a collection of cheap children's gym mats and random carpet pieces and rugs stapled to the wood floor in utter chaos. There were crude paintings of a 1930s Mickey Mouse and elephants, and everything was super creepy. The basement was the worst. The stairs to the basement extended down below the level of dirt under the stairs, literal earth. You couldn't tell how deep back under the stairs went because of the darkness. The ground my wife and our realtor stood on, once off the stairs, was below this dirt floor, so the earth level was about mid-chest height. In this weird basement, there were 2 residential refrigerators and 1 industrial one. There was also a steel workbench with knives. The basement felt like I was surrounded by 1,000 bodiless eyes staring at me. We left and had trouble getting out of that wrought iron fence and of what I now call the serial killer house. I was feeling pretty uneasy, but that easiness was made tenfold when the realtor told us that if we were interested in the house, that they were obligated to inform us that the house had been the place of several murders. In my old apartment, when I was around 8 years old, so many strange things happened. My father and I woke up in the middle of the night, just me and he, to the apartment being well over 100 degrees. The heater was on full blast, in the middle of a hot Texan summer. The heater was separate from the AC, and the breaker for it had been in the off position. Well, the breaker was flipped, the thermostat turned up to max, and the heater turned on. My father didn't turn it on, and I couldn't reach the thermostat, which was too high up on the wall for me. I would have needed to stand on a chair, but I couldn't have, without making a ton of noise. Nobody had been in the apartment either. It was well secured. That wasn't the first thing though. Late one night, we were watching TV in the living room, which was around 10 feet from the kitchen. We suddenly hear a loud banging metal sound. My father goes into the kitchen and finds several magnets from the fridge in the sink. They would have had to have flown a good 2 to 3 feet straight off the fridge to make it into the sink. Obviously, it was neither of us. This happened on its own. Similarly, some pictures that were on the wall in the hallway fell off the wall and were standing straight up against the opposite wall. If they simply fell off the hook, they were heavy enough to fall straight to the floor, not land on the opposite wall. All during this time, I had several nightmares. I would hear someone banging chains in the middle of the night and see things in the shadows. It could have just been my over-imagination, but it seemed real to me. My father got an idea once to record a silent room like a paranormal investigator. On the recording, we could hear people speaking in German very clearly. almost like they were in the next room. This was in the middle of the night, and we didn't have any neighbours at the time, so it was pretty creepy. After doing a little research, we found out the apartments were named for the ridge on which they stop, a ridge that mostly German settlers used as a lookout point. I don't really know what happened. It was just a series of weird events. We moved out of the apartment after staying there for almost 10 years. My ex lived in an apartment that she was told was haunted. It was small above a shop on the Esplanade in Hervey Bay, Queensland. We didn't believe it was haunted, but weird things kept happening. On more than one occasion, I would be woken up in the middle of the night for no reason, and the front door would always be open. Every single time, there was something that looked like the shadow of a child standing upright in the doorway. I thought it was just me seeing this, but when I told my ex and her roommate about it, they went white. They'd been seeing things too, but not a shadow child. They saw a shadow man, and sometimes a shadow cat. As we talked, we could feel the atmosphere of the apartment pressing in on us. We could feel something in the room with us. I thought it was a bunch of horseshit. I don't believe in ghosts or whatever, but the more we spoke, the more afraid we got. So my ex's roommate called up one of her spiritual friends who does cleansings regularly, and he came into the apartment and instantly broke into a sweat. He told us something bad was going to happen now, and that we needed to be aware of it. We did a cleansing and casting out ritual, and right at the very end, my ex's roommate's CD player switched on and played Bon Jovi's Bad Medicine at full volume. The CD player wasn't plugged in, and did not have any batteries in it. The only way we could go turn it off was to take it across the road to the beach and dump it in the ocean. To start off, I live in Maine. What does this mean though? It means it's very common to see lobstermen, and very rare to see anybody on your property. It's also very cold and snows a lot. Anyway, I was over at a friend's house participating in a party, and a bunch of us guys were going to sleep over. I know, unimaginable, right? Sounds like the plot to a cheap horror movie. We had gone to bed at 3:30 in the morning, on his pull-out couch in the living room. I had just started going to sleep when I noticed a figure standing on the other side of the door, on the porch. I think nothing of it. Probably a weird shadow from the trees. Of course, there's a winter storm going on outside, so the wind is blowing hard, and that's when I notice that this particular shadow isn't moving with the tree's shadow. It's still standing in the door, staring through the windows at us. This is when I call out to the others, who were kind of not really asleep. They are so freaked out that one of them grabs a BB gun, the other one grabs a baseball bat, and I grab my handheld spotlight. There were 4 of us, but the host had passed out. I shine the spotlight through the door, and there's nothing there. We once again reach the conclusion that it simply must be a strange shadow. That is when we start to notice the little details. Staring at the figure, they look like they'd just come off a lobster boat in a heavy rainstorm. They had the lobster hat, and the weird little way the jacket fell told us it was someone dressed up like a lobster man. Like I said earlier, It's extremely common. The part that was freaky was the way the hat kind of sagged around the head, almost unnaturally. Trust me when I say that this hat is old when it sags like that. At this point, we're thinking it's some dick playing a prank on us. So being the main boys we were, we decide to beat the ever-living shit out of this guy. I shine the light to blind them as the other two advance. They reach the door and realize there isn't anyone around the door. So once again, we conclude that it was a shadow from a tree, and they decide to go back to bed. I'm not entirely convinced, and watch the damn thing until about 5 AM, when it just vanishes into thin air after the light came up. My foolish self is thinking that I'm safe, and I fall asleep. I wake up 2.5 hours later to see the host's mother struggling with the trash. Being the good kid I was, I offered to take it out for her because no one was up. As I opened the door to go outside, that's when I see footprints in the snow facing the door. I could see the footprints start at the edge of the porch, up to the stairs, and then stand right at the door. The footprints then kind of looked like the person was pivoting on their right foot to get behind the wall, to escape being seen a couple of times. They then led up to the other edge of the porch, with around a 15-foot drop, and disappear. There's nothing on the other side of the edge, and nothing in the couple of feet of snow below. And while yes, I did first think snowdrift got caught on ice to make the footprints, I then realized they were clear boot prints, with thread and all. The scary part is, the thread matches rain boots, which go with the hat and jacket. This was only my most fearful moment ever. It still makes me shiver just thinking about it. The worst part about this is that people don't believe me, but when you live in Maine, weird haunty stuff happens all the time. I live in a town where the founder was cursed by a witch to have her forever dancing on his grave, and taps think there are ghosts in the fort across the river. Supernatural stuff is kind of normal, but this freaked me out. Last week, I was working late at the bank. It was 11 PM, and I was the last one in. It's pitch black outside, and the bank is essentially isolated, far away from anything nearby. I am very alone. I'm walking around installing new printers, and all of a sudden, the security monitors in my IT room turn off. Odd. I get up and go check the plugs to make sure nothing came loose. As I lean over to inspect the cables, all of the lights in the building die, and I am plunged into darkness. My heart starts racing from the shock, and I feel the adrenaline. I ignore my body being a bitch and reach into my pocket to get my phone to use as a torch. But before I can get it out, the backup lights turn on, and the whole building is dimly lit by the faint green glow of backup lights. The lights are very weak, but it's good enough. A green-tinged blackness. Then I can make out the objects in the room, though most things are in shadow. I leave my phone where it is, and I forget the monitors, and start walking towards the banking hall, where all the tills are, because that's where the circuit breakers are, and I guess it's up to me to fix this shit. The bank is built like a bomb shelter, with thick concrete walls, and multiple heavy block metal doors. I have to swipe my ID card multiple times just to get into the hall, and I am scared that I could get locked in between two doors if the power fail has messed up that system. I'm quietly thinking about what I should be doing if such a thing happened, and I'm still a bit jumpy from the shock earlier. I'm always looking over my shoulder and studying the shadows as I walk past. And that is when I hear a blood-curdling scream. Not a shrill woman's scream, like it would be if this were a film, but the death roar of some deep-voiced barbarian. It's a long, loud and primal scream, and I could almost feel it vibrating in the air. It's coming from the banking hall, and I freeze in place, right before the final door, freaking out, and just stare at all the grey-green locks of the metal door as I listen. The scream seems never-ending. It feels like the guy's been yelling for 3 minutes or more without taking a breath. But the adrenaline makes time-telling difficult. I'm trying to control my breathing, and I check behind me, the shadowy concrete green corridor I came from, and decide that I need to press on. I turn to the door, swipe my card, and open the door as fast as I can, bursting through ready for anything. I manage to scan half the rooms, and as I open the door, I'm blinded by a white, strong light, and the scream suddenly stops. My eyes adjust, and I can see the lights were just the main power reactivating. I'm staring into a normal room. The silence was terrifying. Heart pounding in my chest and ears, but everything seems in order. The white light bouncing pleasantly from letters on tables, and the computers turned off and quiet. The bulletproof glass all fine, door to the front correctly locked. The scream was gone, the screamer unaccounted for, and the lights back on. Being quite freaked out at this point, I left out the back way in a panic and called it a night. Though nothing explicit happened, I hope I helped to convey how the creepiness occurred at night in a dark, large building, and it can make you panic, and how working the graveyard shift isn't always easy. I had just moved back to my hometown after attending an art school for 2 years. The only apartment I could find was a really dumpy loft over a warehouse for $50 a month. This was 1971, way before these kinds of apartments were cool. This was cheap, even for back then, and though I wondered a bit about that, it wasn't totally out of the norm. It did have tall windows and skylights, so it worked great for a studio. Since it was a loft, it was a big wide open space with the bathroom being the only room. There were 2 other doors, one to the stairs down to the street, and the fire escape door that had one of those fire alarms on it, if you go out of it. The bathroom was like a box cubicle with a shower and a sink and toilet. I had been living there for about a month, when one night I woke up and went to use the bathroom. The door had a small sliding lock on it, and I always lock it out of habit. Just as I was about to leave, I heard heavy footsteps walking up the bathroom door, and I watched in horror as the doorknob turned and rattled, shaking the whole door. It was the first time in my life where I was so scared that I actually felt my body go completely numb. I thought for sure that someone had gotten in, and I was now getting ready to be raped or killed. The lock was a little wimpy thing that honestly a granny could have broken. The doorknob rattled several more times, then something hit the door really hard. I then heard the footsteps walk away and go down the steps. I heard the door to the street open and close, then silence. I think it took me nearly 30 minutes to leave the bathroom and go down. When I finally did turn on every light in the place, and I went to inspect the door to the street, there were 3 locks on that door. 2 of them could only be locked from the inside, and they were locked. Nothing could have come or gone in that way. I even checked the fire escape, but it was locked in a similar fashion. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. As it turned out, that was the scariest thing to happen in the loft. After that, I would hear footsteps and the door open and close all the time, and a few other not so scary things. The place convinced me, and quite a few other people, that these things were real. I ended up living there for 3 years and would have stayed longer, but the place got sold and the new owner wanted to move to the loft themselves. They only lived there for 2 months before moving out. Wimps. My grandparents' house has had poltergeist activity since the 1970s. It started when my mother and her 2 sisters, Louise and Teresa, were playing around in a cemetery. I know, what were they doing playing in a cemetery? And to be honest, you've got me on that one. My mother apparently forgot about the age-old "don't walk on the actual graves, you asshole" rule while they were playing hide and seek, and was running from Teresa. She stepped on a grave and the ground gave way and she fell into the grave. According to her, the grave was from 1907 and bore the same name as hers. They scooped some of the dirt out, took it home, and got the Ouija board. Jimi Hendrix had just passed away, and her older sister decided that she wanted to contact him. They decided that the best way to increase the power of the board was to sprinkle the grave dirt around it, light some candles, and turn out the lights. Jimi Hendrix did not answer them, obviously, but a woman named Amy did, and she apparently thoroughly chastised them for being naughty girls. The planchette immediately after moved to goodbye. According to all 3 women, the room was silent until the wind picked up outside and blew around the outside of the house in such a way that it sounded like a shrieking woman and a moaning man at the same time. There was no wind in the room, yet the candle flames instantly went out, and the lamp on the bedside table switched itself off. All 3 girls ran out of the room and hid in their father's bedroom between the wall and the bed. After they calmed down and no longer felt threatened, they discussed what should be done next. They went back into Louise's bedroom, where they had been performing the seance, brushed the dirt into a linen handkerchief, retrieved the board, retrieved salt and matches from the cupboard in the kitchen, and went outside in the backyard. They said the Lord's Prayer while holding hands and sprinkled the board and grave dirt with salt, poured gasoline on it, and burnt it. They went back inside, feeling like this was over, and tried not to think about it anymore. Nothing happened for a few weeks, until the youngest sister, Louise, began having terrible nightmares, to which she would wake up screaming several times a night. My mother was next, followed by her older sister, Teresa. My grandparents, both very quiet and not the type to tell tales, described the upcoming months as nights with no sleep, rushing from one room to another, flicking lights on and off, falling into bed after soothing one daughter, drifting into sleep, only to be awoken by another screaming girl. This went on for several months, and then stopped abruptly. Just as my grandparents were beginning to feel well rested, Louise began screaming for her mother and father in the night again. "There are people in my room!" According to Louise, She would wake up because she could hear people talking, and when she would open her eyes, the bedroom lights would be on, and there would be a man and a woman standing in the corner of her bedroom, sipping cocktails and having discussions about the weather. My grandmother started sleeping in a bed with her now 16-year-old daughter. For the first few days, nothing happened. Then my aunt poked her awake in the middle of the night. Grandma opened her eyes and looked around the room, seeing nothing and heard no noises. And when she began to ask Louise why she woke her, Louise grabbed a fistful of her nightgown and said, "Shh," and then the lamp on the bedside table turned itself off. My grandmother jumped out of bed, grabbed Louise by the arm and dragged her into my grandpa's bedroom. She woke him up, told him what happened, and they both slept in his bed for the next several weeks, until Teresa, now 18, was going off to college and moved out, at which time they moved Louise into Teresa's old bedroom. There were more things that happened over the years, but it slowly tapered off into an every once in a while thing, once they moved Louise into another bedroom. Now, 47 years later, that bedroom is like a time capsule. My grandmother used to clean it weekly, but they never moved anything out of it except Louise's clothing. All the furnishings have stayed the same, and after years of refurbishing every other room in the house, that room still has pea green shag carpeting, an orange and gold owl wallpaper. Since Grandma died 10 years ago, and no one has really bothered with the room except for the occasional clean, when there are one too many extra overnight guests, and someone has to sleep there. And no one ever makes it all night. We almost always wake up to find this person sleeping on the couch. At night, when no one's in the room, you can hear people talking. A lot of people. Like there's some kind of party going on in there coming from that room. As a child, that room was the source of nightmares. All the other cousins would play tricks on the younger ones to force them into that room, only to lock them in. I myself was locked in the closet when I was 7, but that's a whole nother story. Until their cries for help attracted adult attention, or even just the standard, "You're too little to play with us. You have to stay in the back bedroom for 5 minutes alone if you want to play." They've been small bouts of activity through the house over the years, but it's really just something that everyone got used to. And for the last 35 years or so, the room has kind of just belonged to them. My older cousin actually locked me in the closet in that room when I was about 5. I say locked, but all she really did was close the door. I don't remember why I couldn't get out, but I remember trying to open the door and not being able to. I didn't want to yell for help, because that would make me a chicken, and she wouldn't want to play with me anymore, and it would get her in trouble, and she wouldn't want to play with me even more after that. So I sat on the floor of the closet with my back to the wall. It was quiet for a moment, and I heard footsteps outside the door, so I thought she was finally going to let me out, but she didn't. According to her and everyone else in the house, she had gone outside to ride her bike. I heard the wire coat hanger start moving back and forth across the rail on its own, scraping back and forth, and then an old doll fell from the top shelf and landed in front of me. It was the kind that had the little sandbox inside, and when it landed at me, I looked at its little sad plastic face, and it said, "Mama." I started screaming bloody murder, and pounded on the door, and my grandfather came to the rescue. I remember hearing him running down the hallway and seeing him sling the door open. It was really traumatic for me, probably not as traumatic for my cousin, and he made her sleep in that room all by herself that night as punishment. She's pretty much hated my guts ever since, but it was all her fault anyway. I'm glad my grandpa gave her a taste of her own medicine. I was about 12 years old and staying at my grandparents' house after my aunt's wedding. The house itself wasn't very big and was the same house that my mother and her brothers and sisters lived in growing up. After the wedding reception was over, my mum wanted to take me back to my grandparents for the night, so all of the aunts could go out and get a couple more drinks. When we arrived at the house, my mother and I both could very faintly hear a baby crying, with a woman talking, trying to comfort the baby. Now this house isn't very big, so you can hear pretty much any noise in any point of the house. Our initial thoughts were that someone forgot to turn off the TVs in the house, so we both walked around the house trying to find the TVs that were left on. To our surprise, not a single TV or radio was left on, but the volume of the woman and the baby remained constant. It didn't matter which room we were in. If we were in the basement or the landing, the volume of the lady and the baby was always the same. This, of course, scared the shit out of me, as I never believed in ghosts before this happened, but there was no other explanation for it. Now my mother was a little freaked out as well, but she had a bar to get to, and she then just told me that it was nothing, got in her car, and left me alone in the ghost house. I immediately switched on the TV, with the volume as highest as it could go, without blasting out my eardrums. I was exhausted, but drank pop to not let my body fall asleep and give this thing an opportunity to attack me whilst I was asleep. My parents showed up a couple of hours later, to a kid, all wild on sugar, just staring at the TV screen. I later told my aunt who grew up in that house the story, and she was ecstatic. She had always claimed that she heard a woman and the baby in the house growing up, but nobody believed her. Ever since that day, I believe that something like ghosts exists to some degree. It doesn't matter how much evidence or data that people show me claiming they don't exist. I know what I heard, and it gives me chills just thinking about it. At least mine was pretty nice, and didn't break glass and other shit like some of the stories. My godfather, who was pretty much my dad, had a mild stroke whilst I was at college across the country. I came back home when the semester had ended. The combination, the stroke, a bad back, and diabetes were taking their toll on him and made it very hard for him to walk. He used a quad cane, but sometimes his legs would unexpectedly give out on him, and he would fall most of the time, and couldn't muster the strength to lift himself back up. So here I am back at home, and taking care of him pretty much 24/7, and I get to the point where I've become such a light sleeper from worrying and the stress that every time he gets up or moves around too much, I wake up. If he gets up to use the restroom, I wake up with him and wait for him to go do his business and come back before I can even think of sleeping again. We were pretty poor. He was a hoarder and the house was in disrepair, so we both shared the same room, with a window unit AC to keep us cool. Instead of a door, he put up one of those extending poles and a thick plastic shower curtain, complete with ridiculously noisy shower rings. He made sure to yell at anyone who wouldn't close it shut behind them, and never failed to do it himself. So one night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps behind me. I'm facing the wall, and it's near pitch black. So I do my usual routine of waiting for my godfather to do his thing. I hear the steps behind me to the door, the shower curtain and rings being flung aside, and then steps leading off to the other side of the house. I lay there waiting for what seemed to be about 5 to 10 minutes, and I started to get concerned. As I'm sitting up to go check on him, I realized that he has violated his own cardinal sin of closing the shower curtains behind him. Not only that, but those steps were way too fast and heavy. At that point, I felt needles go up and down my spine. As I jump out of my bed, I grab the aluminium baseball bat that I have for security as I'm looking out of the open curtains down the hallway, trying to make out anything in the dim light. That's when I hear a cough from the other side of the room. My godfather had been laying in bed this whole time. My first thought was someone had broken into the house, so I gripped the bat, scared as hell, and proceeded to walk around the entire house, ready to bash someone's skull in. But I never found anyone, or any sign of a break-in. Needless to say, it was very difficult to sleep that night. I had just finished my last patrol of the night at an apartment complex, and I was just about to get into my patrol car in the parking lot when I heard a guy shouting at me from somewhere up near top of the apartment building. He was on the 14th floor, I believe, and was screaming for police. I had no idea what the hell was going on, and I scrambled into the building and up to the floor that I thought he was on. Nope, wrong floor. And I take the stairs and run down the hallways until I find his apartment. He was surprisingly calm, although very rude. He told me it took me long enough and that he could have died. When I get to his door, it looks like he'd been on a 5-day booze and meth binge, and I wasn't wrong. His arms were covered in self-inflicted wounds, and I asked him if he would mind if I placed him in handcuffs for the safety of both of us. He actually agrees, and so I put him in cuffs and let him sit on a chair near the front door. His apartment is littered with cardboard boxes, empty beer cans, and obvious drug paraphernalia, crack pipes used, needles, latex tourniquets, and, what I recall, being a couple of lines of cocaine on a countertop. I ask him how he got his injuries, and he tells me that he did them to himself. Naturally, I ask him what he used, and he pointed me to a razor. He then goes on to tell me about how I can call him insane if I want, and goes on a rant about how people are spying on him from his balcony. Clearly I'm not comfortable with this, so I have my dispatcher contact the police. I let him know that the police are on their way, and he's cool with that, until I tell him that we need to go to the lobby to meet the police, as they do not have access to the building. At this point he becomes extremely irate and lunges at me. I'm not sure what he was planning to do whilst being handcuffed, and I wasn't taking any chances. I used some awesome kung fu shit that I had learned in a self-defense course, and the guy goes down on the ground. I inform my dispatcher in the change of situation, and pick up the guy and fight with him down the stairs. I had to stop on every floor in order to get him to stop resisting, because some of his self-mutilation was fresh, and I had blood all over my gloves, clothes, boots, and there was blood all down the stairs, and where I had him up against the wall on every floor. I could just imagine the people waking up in the morning and seeing a trail of blood leading from the top of the stairs all the way down to the bottom. After reaching the lobby, My backup arrived and helped me get the guy under control. The police had apparently been given the wrong address and showed up 45 minutes later after they'd been called. From the start of the incident to finishing the report, I worked an extra hour and a half, and have never taken such a long, thorough shower in my life. Even then, I still feel like I need a wash. This isn't my only story though, as before this, I worked as a security guard in a large shopping mall situated downtown. I saw a drunken man fall off a balcony and land headfirst on the ground below. He lived, but had some seriously nasty wounds. The sound that makes is one I will never forget. Another incident is a man with an apparent mental handicap used the mailroom of an attached business tower as his bathroom. A large puddle of piss, accompanied by shit, smeared down the wall. You could tell he was squatting up against the wall. How he got into the tower was beyond us. Didn't see him enter when we viewed the security camera footage. We only saw him leave. On another occasion, I was patrolling a construction yard and saw a guy rave dance in the middle of the yard. Clearly not supposed to be there. I was shocked, and as I approached him I inquired to exactly what he was doing. He didn't react in the way I would expect for someone rave dancing. Out of the blue, he stops his dance, reaches into his back pocket, and produces a very large knife. Without a second thought, he lunges at me with it. I was completely unprepared, and he hits me straight in the chest. Fortunately, I was wearing my stab vest, so there was no penetration, but he broke the protective plating within the vest. It was a pretty hard stab. He stood there for a moment when he noticed that I was okay, and I managed to detain him. But my God, for those few seconds that you see a knife rushing towards you, you think it could be the end. And that is absolutely horrifying. That feeling of utter fear and terror, knowing that your life could be over in mere seconds. On another occasion, I was patrolling a Ford dealership, and I noticed a guy peeking into windows of cars on the lot. I asked him what exactly he's doing, just striking up a conversation to try and find out who he is. Before I even finished asking him how he is, I found myself staring down the barrel of a handgun. I was scared shitless, again in another situation where I was quite confident that my life could very well and truly be over in a matter of seconds. I find myself unable to move, except my arms, and my hands went up over my head, before I even realized what I was in the middle of. I clearly remember hearing the firing mechanism click against the bullet, but fortunately, through some kind of miracle, it didn't fire. Without thinking, I pressed the emergency alert button on my radio. I ran and ducked behind a car, and immediately described the suspect in as much detail as I could. Police, K9 and helicopters dispatched, and find the guy hiding under a CAT tractor in a nearby heavy equipment dealership. On another occasion, I was patrolling a rather sketchy apartment building with my partner, and we found ourselves having to arrest some chick for assault by trespass, as she spat in my partner's face whilst we attempted to escort her from the property. She did not live there and had no reason to be in the building. A guy, unrelated to the incident, saw me trying to place my handcuffs on this chick and decided it would be a good idea to football tackle me. I find myself unable to breathe and coughing up blood. Contusions to the left lung was what caused that. While defending myself from a drunk, high, 6'5", 200-pound man, as I'm 5'7" and 170 pounds, backup arrives along with police. and we tackle and arrest the man for assault, as well as assault on a peace officer, and he tried to trip and kick one of the police officers. When the court date finally came, he showed up wearing a leather jacket, dirty jeans, a ripped t-shirt and smelling of weed. He shouted in court, claimed I tried to get him in a headlock, which wouldn't have been relevant anyway, and needless to say he was convicted. When I was working at the mall, I was dispatched to one of the parkades attached to the mall, and was after a woman who called our security office via help phone. The dispatcher tells me that the woman was hysterical and unable to explicitly say what was wrong, but on the security cameras, there is a car near the help phone, parked in a stall, with the front passenger door ajar, and what appeared to be blood on the windshield. The driver is in his seat but not moving. Fearing the worst, our entire team rushes over there. When we arrive, my supervisor tries to get the woman, who has blood all over her, and tell him what happened. I look in the car and see a young man in his early 20s passed out in the driver's seat, pants down, and a very much severed penis, only attached by some flesh. The car had strobe lights inside, the kind that are activated by the stereo system's base, and he was apparently an epileptic. She was giving him head when he had a seizure, and he's still profusely bleeding. So I grabbed gauze from my medkit and attached to a drop leg holster device on my leg and apply pressure to this guy's crotch. Police, fire and EMT arrive, and during extrication, they accidentally tear his penis off. That was an interesting report to write. I think he did manage to get it put back together. As for whether it worked or not, I will never know. On another incident in the mall, just after closing up from public access, we were heading back to the security office to do a briefing when my supervisor, myself, and our regional manager witnessed an attempted suicide. A guy tried to jump off the third-level balcony and landed on the escalators on the second floor. I ran up to the adjacent escalator, which was moving downwards, and hit the emergency shut-off button when I reached him. Broken bones galore, and some seriously nasty gashes on his face from the grooves of the escalator steps. Emergency services and the fire team arrive, and he's transported to hospital. I don't think he was successful in his endeavour, and I'm glad he wasn't. I don't know how well he got patched up, but I hope that kid's doing okay. A few years later, I was patrolling a subsidized condo property that the company had a contract with. Very sketchy area. We're walking around when we hear some shouting, and we move to investigate. We saw a guy throw a rock through one of the condo's front windows, so we try and run after him. He gets into his car though, and peels off out of the parking lot. We're instructed by our supervisor to follow him in our patrol car, and that just happened to be right next to us, so we do. He notices that we're following him, and decides to take off at a high rate of speed. By this time, police have already been notified. We follow him until he turns off the road and onto a major freeway. We speed up and follow him as safely as possible, giving the police dispatcher directions. The guy, who was going at least 160 kilometers an hour now on a 70 km/h road, loses control of his vehicle and slams into the concrete median and a light pole. The impact sends the vehicle into the air and rolls over, ejecting the guy from the car. He was seriously messed up. Human meat and debris from the vehicle litter both sides of the freeway, which was empty at this hour, thankfully. He was still alive, but his face was mostly destroyed. He was rushed to the hospital, and we were interviewed by police, and my partner spoke to someone from the local news stations. We were told to go home early. Last I heard, The guy was in a vegetative state in our trauma hospital. On another incident, patrolling a subsidized apartment building for at-risk inner-city retirees, essentially a nice way of putting homeless men over the age of 55, I walked in on a legless prostitute laying on the floor of our rec room, pants down, and playing with herself. She reeked of BO and booze, and the smell of crystal meth, and I could smell her for at least 10 feet away. She was a regular there, and had previously been banned from the property. I didn't want to arrest her. Honestly, I didn't even want to touch her. But she had an arrest warrant, and was advised by police to hold her on the property. I managed to coerce her to pull her pants up, and bum her way down the stairs to the main floor. The police arrived, and they didn't even want to touch her. Honestly, I felt bad that she was living such a life, but at the same time, it's just nasty. These types of things have happened to me since I was 13 or so. In just about every house that I've lived, as we moved a lot growing up. The first time I remember anything weird was with my closet. I would shut it at night, but it would be open in the morning. For a week or so, this happened. One night, something woke me up. I had bunk beds in my room, and was laying on the bottom bunk, staring in the dark room. First, I noticed the closet was open. Then I noticed a crouched human-like shadow figure at the bedroom door. Like in the doorway. I just panicked. I jumped and pulled on the curtain chain on my ceiling fan, but it was off at the switch next to the door. I ran to the door and flipped the switch, only now the light was off still, because I had pulled the chain. I was sobbing at that point. I ran back to the chain, and the light came on that time, and there was nothing there. I don't think I've ever been so terrified. I convinced myself that it had been my mum's friend staying in our guest house pulling some kind of prank, though no one ever admitted to it. Nothing ever happened again at that house. I would come home from work to find my toilet seat up, and all my curtains open. Opening the curtains was something I never bothered to do at 17 years old, especially since I left for work at 4:30 a.m. It happened every day. At night, I would flush the toilet, and I heard steps walk through the kitchen. My mum agreed to let me take the family dog to live with me, because I was so creeped out. I was sure someone was coming in whilst I was gone. He was aggressive. I would never allow anyone in the house. I came home one time to find the dog had actually torn up the curtains, which is creepy now, but I wrote it off as separation anxiety at the time. Still, the toilet seat was up every day after work, and my dog heard the flushing and footsteps as well. He would bark and growl and stare into the kitchen with his fur standing up. Another apartment, a bell or alarm thing started going off randomly. It was hidden behind ceiling tiles. It even went off after we cut the wires. Still had no idea what the bell went to, and the landlord didn't know. Finally, we tore it out and threw it away. My current house, I've had things move in front of me. My dog barks at corners, and one night, my touch lamp turned on, and still occasionally does, completely independently. Not to mention that someone, who clearly wasn't there, had tried opening my bedroom door in the middle of the night. My door doesn't shut right, and there's no need to turn the knob. You just push and it opens, yet someone was jiggling the knob like it was locked. My husband yelled, "Come in," thinking it was my sister, but no one came. I got up a few minutes later to see what she wanted, and she swore it wasn't her. It follows me everywhere. I'm pretty used to it at this point. As long as there's no scary crouching shadow people, I think it's pretty cool. When I was little, I used to be exceedingly paranoid, to the point I would bathe with the door open. I personally blame it on my brother, who loved to freak me out. He would constantly bullshit 10-year-old me with stories about dreaming of people at the window looking in. I know now that most of this was fake, but at the time, I didn't. I was bathing with the door open per usual, soaking up the warmth around me and enjoying myself. What happened next? I don't expect the majority of you to believe. Perhaps I was getting tired or something,